In April 1943, over the occupied skies of Belgium, German fighter pilots looked up and couldn't believe what they were seeing. The Americans were flying what appeared to be cargo planes into combat. The bulky machines approaching at 25,000 feet seemed absurd compared to the sleek, agile fighters the Luftwaffe had dominated Europe with for years. Captain Werner Schroer of Fighter Wing 26 radioed his formation with barely concealed amusement. "The Americans are flying barrels," he said. Within months, those barrels would transform the air war over Europe, turning German mockery into terror and confidence into desperation. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt looked nothing like a fighter aircraft should look. When it rolled out of the factory in Farmingdale, Long Island, in 1941, even American pilots weren't sure what to make of it. The thing was enormous. At over 4 tons empty, it weighed nearly twice as much as a Spitfire. Its massive radial engine dominated the nose, giving it the appearance of a flying milk jug, a nickname that would stick throughout the war. The jug. It was 7 tons when fully loaded with fuel, ammunition, and pilot. To put that in perspective, it was the heaviest single-engine fighter of the entire war, built by any nation. The British pilots who first saw it at English airfields in late 1942 shook their heads and quietly told their American counterparts they were about to die. This lumbering beast would never survive against the Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s that had been perfected through years of combat over Europe and Russia. The P-47 was designed by Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian immigrant who had fled the Bolsheviks and found his way to the United States through Turkey. Working for Republic Aviation, Kartveli had been tasked in 1940 with creating a lightweight interceptor to replace the earlier P-43 Lancer. But as reports came back from the Battle of Britain and the savage air combat over France, it became clear that lightweight wasn't going to cut it. The Americans needed a fighter that could take punishment, climb to extreme altitudes, and carry enough armament to shred anything it encountered. What Kartveli proposed was revolutionary and slightly insane. He wanted to build the fighter around the most powerful engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial beast that produced 2,000 horsepower. To maximize high-altitude performance, he designed an elaborate turbocharger system that ran through hundreds of feet of ducting in the aircraft's belly. The entire airplane had to be designed around this ductwork. First the air system, then everything else fit around it. The result was a fighter that looked more like a water tower with wings than anything that should be capable of air combat. The first prototype flew on May 6, 1941, and immediately demonstrated shocking performance. It was fast, brutally fast, reaching speeds that approached 430 miles per hour. But it was also heavy, unresponsive in turns, and climbed like it was hauling freight. When the Army Air Forces began receiving P-47Bs in March 1942, the 56 Fighter Group at Bradley Field in Connecticut became the first unit to fly them. The training period was a disaster. Pilots crashed regularly. Engines failed. Landing gear collapsed. Fires broke out in flight. 18 men died before the 56th even left American soil. Some pilots flatly refused to fly it. The commanding officer, Colonel Hubert Zemke, a stern but brilliant tactician, looked at this 7-ton monster and realized that trying to dogfight in it would be suicide. Instead, he developed entirely new tactics. The P-47 couldn't turn with a Messerschmitt, but it could dive faster than anything in the sky. Zemke drilled his pilots relentlessly on a simple principle: dive, fire, and recover. Use altitude and speed. Never get into a turning fight. Hit hard and get out. In January 1943, the 56th Fighter Group sailed to England aboard the HMS Queen Elizabeth. They arrived at a moment when the 8th Air Force desperately needed help. American bombers were being slaughtered over Europe. Without fighter escort deep into Germany, the B-17s and B-24s faced swarms of Luftwaffe fighters that attacked from every angle, shooting down dozens of bombers on single missions. The losses were unsustainable. The Spitfire couldn't reach far enough. The P-38 Lightning was still scarce. The P-47 was the only option, but nobody believed it would work. The 4th Fighter Group, made up of American pilots who had flown with the RAF Eagle squadrons, absolutely hated the Thunderbolt when they received it. These men had loved the nimble Spitfire, with its fingertip controls and graceful maneuverability. The P-47 felt like flying a bathtub. Major Don Blakesley, a legendary pilot who had scored kills in Spitfires, took one look at the jug and said it ought to be able to dive, since it certainly couldn't climb. His disdain filtered down through the entire unit. The first combat mission came on March 10, 1943, when the 4th Fighter Group conducted a sweep over France. Radio malfunctions made communication impossible, and the mission was a complete failure. After British radios were installed, operations resumed on April 8th. Then came April 15th, 1943. This was the day the P-47 scored its first aerial victory, and the day German pilots first encountered what they thought would be easy prey. Major Don Blakesley, despite his earlier criticism, managed to sneak up on a Focke-Wulf 190 in a diving attack and shot it down near Ostend. But the mission cost the Americans dearly. 3 P-47s were lost, 1 shot down in combat, and 2 to engine failures that continued to plague the early models. German pilots reported seeing the American fighters and barely bothering to engage them. They looked slow, ungainly, and unthreatening. The Luftwaffe aces, many of whom had hundreds of missions over Russia and the Mediterranean, dismissed the Thunderbolts as no match for their own aircraft. Meanwhile, over the next several weeks, the 56th Fighter Group under Zemke began flying escort missions to protect bomber formations. The Luftwaffe quickly learned that altitude was where the P-47 ruled. Above 30,000 feet, the turbocharger gave a performance that no German fighter could match. But at lower altitudes, the story was different. The P-47 was slower to accelerate, couldn't turn as tightly, and seemed vulnerable. German pilots started testing these new American fighters, probing for weaknesses. What they didn't know was that every engagement was teaching the American pilots how to survive. On May 4, 1943, a massive escort mission sent 117 P-47s to protect bombers attacking Antwerp and Paris. Colonel Zemke lost radio communication over the Dutch coast and had to turn back, furious that his men might think he had abandoned them. The mission turned into a swirling dogfight at 31,000 feet. The 56th Fighter Group destroyed 17 German fighters that day while losing only one of their own. Among the German dead was Major Wilhelm Galland, commander of a squadron in the elite Jagdgeschwader 26, who had 55 kills to his name. When the American pilots learned they had killed one of Germany's top aces, they realized they were no longer the inexperienced novices everyone thought they were. By this time, someone in the 56th started calling them Zemke's Wolfpack. The name stuck, but it was on June 26, 1943, that the P-47's reputation for toughness became legendary, and German confidence began its first serious cracks. That afternoon, 48 P-47CS from the 56th Fighter Group took off from RAF Manston to escort B, 17 bombers returning from a raid on Villacoublay airfield near Paris. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a young pilot from Oklahoma, flying at the rear of the 61st Squadron's formation, was still learning the brutal realities of combat. As the Thunderbolts approached the rendezvous point near Forges-les-Eaux in northern France, 16 Focke-Wulf 190s from Jagdgeschwader 26 struck from above and behind. The attack was perfectly executed, the kind of veteran ambush that had killed hundreds of Allied pilots. The first pass scattered the American formation. Johnson's P-47 took the brunt of the assault. 21 20mm cannon shells tore into his fuselage. The hydraulic system ruptured, spraying fluid that blinded him. The canopy shattered. A cannon round exploded behind his headrest and jammed the canopy shut. Shrapnel embedded itself in his leg. A machine gun bullet grazed the tip of his nose, destroying his oxygen mask. Fire erupted in the cockpit. The P-47 began spinning toward the earth, trailing smoke and flame. Johnson tried desperately to bail out, bracing his feet against the cockpit and pulling with all his strength on the jammed canopy. It wouldn't budge. He was trapped in a burning aircraft, falling out of the sky at terminal velocity. Most pilots would have died in the spin, but Johnson managed to kick in left rudder and pulled back on the stick hard enough to level the wings and stop the spin. The fire went out. Somehow, impossibly, the big Pratt and Whitney radial was still running, blinded by hydraulic fluid, weak from lack of oxygen, flying an airplane that had been shot to pieces. Johnson pointed the nose toward England and hoped. That's when the German pilot came back. A blue and yellow Focke-Wulf 190 appeared beside Johnson's crippled Thunderbolt. The pilot, believed to be Oberstleutnant Egon Mayer, one of the Luftwaffe's deadliest aces with over 60 kills, looked at the shredded American fighter in disbelief. Mayer flew alongside for several moments, then positioned himself behind Johnson for the killing shot. He opened fire. The P-47 shuddered as more rounds tore through the airframe, but it kept flying. Mayer attacked again and again, emptying his ammunition trying to knock the Thunderbolt out of the sky. Nothing worked. The massive radial engine absorbed hit after hit. The thick armor plating behind the pilot's seat stopped rounds that should have killed Johnson. The airframe, designed with redundant systems and structural strength that seemed almost wasteful, refused to break apart. As Johnson approached the English Channel, Mayer made one final pass, firing everything he had left. The P-47 kept flying. Mayer was out of ammunition. He pulled up alongside Johnson one more time, looked at the impossible sight of a fighter that should have disintegrated 10 minutes ago, and raised his hand in salute. Then he peeled off and returned to base. Johnson nursed his dying Thunderbolt back to RAF Manston and somehow landed it. When ground crews pried him out of the cockpit, they found him covered in burns and shrapnel wounds. He walked to his aircraft to inspect the damage and started counting bullet holes. He stopped at 200 without even walking around the entire plane. The mechanics counted 21 20mm cannon strikes and more than 200 machine gun hits. The P-47 was a total write-off, but it had brought him home. Word of Johnson's survival rippled through both Allied and German squadrons. For the Americans, it confirmed what Zenke had been telling them. The P-47 could take punishment no other fighter could survive. For the Germans, it was the first hint that something was wrong with their assumptions. A fighter that absorbed 21 cannon shells and over 200 machine gun rounds and still flew shouldn't exist. 5 days later, Robert Johnson was back in the cockpit. By October, he had become an ace. He would finish the war with 27 confirmed kills, becoming the first American pilot in Europe to surpass Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26 victories. Every single one of his kills came while flying the P-47 Thunderbolt. Meanwhile, the German pilots who had mocked the Jug in April were starting to learn respect. On October 8, 1943, Johnson shot down Oberstleutnant Hans Philipp, commander of Jägerschwader 1 and a veteran with over 500 combat missions and more than 200 kills. Johnson's combat report was brief. Saw hits along the body, he wrote. Aircraft exploded. No parachute. If Philipp, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced aces, couldn't survive against the P-47, what hope did anyone else have? The psychological impact on German pilots was profound. Throughout October 1943, Zenke's Wolfpack claimed 39 enemy aircraft destroyed while losing only one of their own. The P-47 had learned to exploit its strengths mercilessly. At high altitude, above 30,000 feet, the turbocharged double Wasp engine gave it supremacy. German fighters choked and lost power up there, while the Thunderbolt was in its element. American pilots would climb to altitude, wait for German formations attacking bombers, then dive at speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. Nothing could outrun a diving P-47. Even when the Germans introduced jet fighters late in the war, the Thunderbolt could dive fast enough to escape. German pilots developed special techniques to avoid the P-47's boom and zoom attacks, but these tactics required abandoning bomber interceptions, which was exactly what the Americans needed. The P-47 had succeeded in its primary mission, protecting the bombers. By late 1943, Luftwaffe units began withdrawing from coastal areas, clustering around targets deeper in Germany, where they hoped to catch bombers after the P-47s reached their range limits and had to turn back. But the P-47 was evolving. Engineers added drop tanks that extended range dramatically. The D model, which entered service in spring 1944, featured a bubble canopy for better visibility, more powerful engine variants using water injection for emergency power, and paddle blade propellers that increased climb rate by 40%. These improvements transformed an already deadly aircraft into something even more formidable. Major Joseph Priller, a German ace who had initially mocked the Thunderbolt, later admitted in captivity that it was the perfect fighter bomber. The guns never jammed, he said. They never overheated. It outmatched all our expectations. We laughed at them in 1943. Priller said. Nobody laughs now. By 1944, the P-47 was flying more than just escort missions. In January of that year, General James Doolittle lifted restrictions on ground attack operations. The Thunderbolt, with its ability to carry 2,500 pounds of bombs or 10 5-inch rockets in addition to its 850 caliber machine guns, became the Allies' premier ground attack aircraft. The transformation was remarkable. An airplane designed to fight at 40,000 feet was now screaming in at treetop level, destroying everything German forces tried to move. From D-Day on June 6, 1944, until V-Day on May 7, 1945, P-47 pilots claimed the destruction of over 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. The statistics are almost incomprehensible in scale. During Operation Cobra near Rancy, France, on July 29, 1944, the 405th Fighter Group attacked a German column trapped by American armor. In 6.5 hours of continuous attacks, they destroyed 66 tanks, 204 vehicles, and 11 artillery pieces. Ground crews examining the wreckage later could barely comprehend the devastation. German Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of all German forces in the West, told his captors after the war that Allied air attacks made it impossible to bring a single railroad train across the Rhine. While this was an overstatement born of frustration, it reflected the psychological impact of constant P-47 attacks on German logistics and morale. The sight of Thunderbolts became synonymous with destruction for German forces. Soldiers knew with certainty that any aircraft they saw overhead was Allied. The Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force by mid-1944. German troops moved only at night or in terrible weather. Daylight movement meant death. The P-47 groups of the 9th Air Force, operating in direct support of ground forces, perfected the art of close air support. They flew cab-rank missions, circling above the battlefield ready to be called in by forward air controllers when needed. They developed skip bombing techniques to destroy bridges. They learned to identify and hit fuel depots, ammunition dumps, and command posts. Meanwhile, the 8th Air Force P-47 groups continued bomber escort and air superiority missions. The 56th Fighter Group, still flying P-47s by choice when other units switched to the longer-range P-51 Mustang, finished the war with 677.5 air-to-air kills and 311 ground kills. They were the top-scoring fighter group in the 8th Air Force. They produced 39 aces, including the 2 leading American aces in Europe, Francis Gabby Gabreski with 28 kills and Robert Johnson with 27. Both men flew P-47s exclusively. The irony was not lost on anyone who understood aviation. An aircraft that had been dismissed, even hated by many of the pilots who first flew it, had become the most produced American fighter of the war. Between 1941 and 1945, Republic built 15,683 Thunderbolts. More P-47s were built than any other American fighter. The aircraft flew more than 546,000 combat sorties, dropping 132,000 tons of bombs and destroying nearly 12,000 enemy aircraft. The loss rate was exceptionally low, just 0.7% per mission. That meant for every 100 sorties, less than 1 Thunderbolt was lost. The kill ratio was 4.6 to 1, meaning for every P-47 lost in air combat, American pilots shot down more than 4 German aircraft. These numbers tell only part of the story. The real measure of the P-47's impact was how it changed the air war. In early 1943, the Luftwaffe still contested Allied air superiority. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe had been effectively destroyed as an offensive force. German pilots were flying obsolete tactics in depleted formations, with inadequate fuel and minimal training. The experienced aces who had survived the Eastern Front and North Africa campaigns were dead or captured. The P-47 groups had pushed them back, killed them, or forced them into defensive postures that made bomber interception impossible. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 demonstrated both the Luftwaffe's desperation and the P-47's continued dominance. Hitler had husbanded his remaining fighters for one final offensive, planning the attack for winter when weather would ground Allied aircraft. On January 1, 1945, nearly 1,000 German fighters and bombers launched a surprise attack on Allied airfields. More than 200 Allied aircraft were destroyed on the ground, including numerous P-47s. It seemed like a success, but the Germans lost more than 300 aircraft and nearly all their pilots. They had traded irreplaceable experienced pilots and aircraft for planes that Allied factories could replace in days. Fighter General Adolf Galland wrote later that the Luftwaffe received its death blow in the Ardennes. Meanwhile, the P-47s that survived kept flying, kept destroying German forces, kept making movement impossible. When weather permitted missions, the Thunderbolts flew. When it didn't, they waited. Either way, the outcome was inevitable. Individual stories of P-47 toughness became legendary throughout both sides. There were accounts of Thunderbolts returning with entire cylinders shot off the radial engine, still flying on the remaining cylinders. Pilots landed with control surfaces mostly destroyed, with hydraulic systems completely gone, with sections of wing missing. One pilot joked you could walk around inside a P-47 during long missions, an exaggeration but a reflection of how spacious the cockpit was compared to other fighters. Tall pilots who couldn't fit in a P-51 or Spitfire found the P-47 comfortable. Some pilots preferred to belly land a damaged jug rather than bail out, trusting the airframe to hold together in a crash. The massive radial engine acted like a battering ram, smashing through obstacles and absorbing impact that would have killed pilots in other aircraft. Lieutenant Edwin Wright of the 404th Fighter Group completed 39 missions, supporting the Allied advance through France, and survived being hit by flak 6 times. After one mission, ground crews found an 8-inch hole in his propeller blade. If the damage had been 1.5 inches over on either side, the blade would have separated and brought him down. He kept flying it. The P-47 also served in every theater of the war, not just Europe. In the Pacific, the 348th Fighter Group flew P-47s out of Port Moresby, New Guinea, beginning in mid-1943. Colonel Neil Kirby of the 348th became an ace and earned the Medal of Honor on October 11, 1943, when he led a flight of 4 P-47s against 40 Japanese aircraft over Wewak. In the ensuing battle, Kirby shot down 6 enemy planes. He scored 22 kills total before being shot down and killed in March 1944. In Italy, the Brazilian Air Force flew P-47s as part of the 12th Air Force from November 1944 onward, flying 445 missions and earning a Presidential Unit Citation decades later for their effectiveness. The Royal Air Force received 825 P-47s under Lend-Lease and used them extensively in Burma against the Japanese, where the rugged radial engine proved more reliable in tropical conditions than liquid-cooled engines that required constant maintenance. The Soviet Union received 203 P-47s, though they used them primarily for rear-area air defense rather than the ground attack role that had made the type so effective elsewhere. By war's end, the P-47 had proven something fundamental about aircraft design. Elegance and beauty don't win wars. Survivability, firepower, and the ability to absorb punishment win wars. The P-51 Mustang gets remembered as the beautiful fighter, sleek and graceful. But the Mustang's liquid-cooled engine was vulnerable, and a single hit to the cooling system meant a dead engine and a forced landing or bailout. The P-47's air-cooled radial could lose cylinders, take repeated hits, and keep running. Pilots loved the P-47 not because it was pretty but because it brought them home. The long-term influence of the Thunderbolt extended far beyond World War II. The aircraft served in various air forces into the 1960s. Peru didn't retire its P-47s until 1966. The U.S. Air Force kept them in the Air National Guard until 1954. But more significantly, the concept of a heavily armed ground attack aircraft designed to survive intense enemy fire became the foundation for the A-10 Thunderbolt II, introduced in the 1970s. The A-10, nicknamed the Warthog, was deliberately named to honor the P-47. Both aircraft shared the same philosophy: build it tough, arm it heavily, and make it capable of flying home with catastrophic damage. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt is a story about underestimation and vindication. German pilots who laughed at the bulky American fighters in April 1943 were dead or captured by 1945, killed by the very aircraft they had dismissed. American pilots who hated the Jug when they first flew it came to love it more than any other aircraft. The P-47 wasn't beautiful. It wasn't elegant. It was a 7-ton hammer that beat the Luftwaffe into submission through sheer rugged persistence. It protected the bombers when nothing else could reach them. It destroyed the German army's ability to move and resupply. It killed thousands of experienced Luftwaffe pilots and forced the survivors into defensive tactics that made them irrelevant. In many ways, the entire episode demonstrates how warfare rewards practicality over aesthetics, substance over style. The fighters that looked impressive meant nothing if they couldn't take a hit and keep fighting. The pilots who mocked the ungainly American fighters didn't live long enough to regret their arrogance. What do you think of the P-47 Thunderbolt? Was it a brutally effective weapon that won through firepower and toughness? Or was it simply fortunate to face a deteriorating enemy force? Should we remember the survivability that brought pilots home, or the massive destruction it brought to ground targets? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.